It's wonderful to be with you tonight. The power, of course, of what we're doing now is the fact that does not have to just be a Columbia conversation, but it's indeed a conversation we're going to have with the entire world right now, leveraging the amazing writings of Richard Rothstein. Uh, Mr. Rothstein, I want you to know that you've been amazing in the way in which you've contributed to the dialogue, elevating the dialogue here in Columbia over these last several months, under the leadership of my friend and colleague, Tamika Isaac Devine, and all the other folks who are making this call very possible, helping us understand how our explicit government policies on the federal, state, and local level, discriminatory policies, really have helped us create some of the amazing systemic challenges we see in our cities in this country on race and racism. I hope and pray that as a result of this discussion, that we not only learn, obviously, from the lessons of our past, but we learn from them in a way that helps us realize that our future is also subjective, that we can indeed create the desired future that we want to have with the intentionality and focus of learning what we can from the color of law. And hopefully what I know will be an amazing conversation between you and Dr. Bobby Donaldson. So the best I have right now is a virtual welcome to Columbia. We're so thankful that you took the time to join us today. And I'm going to take this opportunity to pass this on to my dear friend, our former Mayor Pro Tem, and one of our senior members of Columbia City Council, who's doing an amazing job leading this discussion, the Honorable Tamika Isaac Devine.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Rothstein, so much for being here, and Bobby Donaldson, Dr. Donaldson, for your continued partnership. Good evening, everyone. I'm Councilwoman Tamika Isaac Devine, and it is indeed my honor and privilege to welcome you here on behalf, you've heard from our mayor and the other members of Columbia City Council. This discussion is very important to us. The City of Columbia, we pride ourselves on the amazing city that we have, and we value the diversity of our city. But we also understand that our city, as is many other cities, have a history that we have to deal with in order for us to move forward together in an equitable manner. And so the discussion over the last few months has been amazing. I have to say, I was introduced to Richard Rothstein's work about a year and a half ago. I bought the book, I read it. I actually bought the book as a gift for Mayor Benjamin for his birthday. And then after I was reading it, I felt like this was something that was a must read. So I shared it with the members of City Council. I shared it with our Affordable Housing Task Force members and our senior staff. And then in a conversation, we felt like this conversation needed to be elevated to the community level. And so we partnered with Historic Columbia, Columbia SC 63, as well as Richland Library and others. And we are excited about this conversation. The last 2 months have been amazing. The dialogue, the sharing, the aha moments that people have had about what our history means about Columbia, but more importantly, what it means about us moving forward together and addressing issues of systemic racism, as well as really the growth of our city. And so I'm more excited about tonight because we get to hear from the expert himself. Richard Rothstein has done a lot, and I know Melanie Huggins is about to introduce him, but I just have to say, Richard, thank you for allowing me to call you Richard. I'm a big fan. I have been enlightened by your work, inspired by your work, and it drives all of us at Columbia City Council to work every day to make sure that we are doing what we can as policymakers and legislators on the city level, working with our partners on the state and federal level to make sure that we are moving forward to a more equitable city. And so on behalf of the members of City Council, I welcome you all here. I encourage you to join us after this session. In 2 more weeks, we'll have a session hosted by our wonderful Mayor, Steve Benjamin, in which he'll have some fellow mayors that will talk about the path forward. Where do we go from here after we have heard from Mr. Rothstein? We've read the book. Where do we go from here? So I encourage you to continue to participate with our dialogue. If you missed the first 2 sessions, you can go to our YouTube channel to watch those. But please listen tonight, ask questions, and then more importantly, think about how do you fit into us moving forward collectively together and making sure that we have a more equitable, fair, and livable city. So with that, I would love to welcome Melanie Huggins, the director of Richland Library, our amazing director who not only makes sure that we have an amazing library, but has helped us with these Let's Talk Race series. So thank you, Melanie, so much for your partnership, and I will pass it on over to you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Devine. I have to say that you're going to get sick of hearing tonight, Richard, how much we admire your work and how much it's changed us. I know you hear that everywhere you go. Councilwoman Devine called me a while back and she said, I've read this book and I'm putting together this series. And as soon as she said Color of Law, I'm like, oh my gosh, I love that book. We want to get him to come speak for the library. Let us help you do this piece of this dialogue. And so we're thrilled to be partners with the City of Columbia, Historic Columbia, Center for Civil Rights History and Research. We're just really happy that this all had this great synergy. And we were all talking about the same thing, which is really powerful when a bunch of really smart people that have leadership positions can come together under Councilwoman Devine's urging. So thank you for having us be a part of this. I do have to give a shout out to my former board chair, the brilliant Nate Barber. I believe he's on this call. He's participating. He's seen you speak 4 times already. So this is probably his 5th time hearing you, but he's the one who told me about your book and said, you've got to read this book. It'll change the way you think about everything. And it really has. It's changed my personal journey, but it's changed our library's journey as well. We're an organization that employs 400 people at 13 locations, and we've been working really hard to apply a racial equity lens to all of our policies and procedures. It's resulted in some really great outcomes for us. We're also, as Councilwoman Devine mentioned, we have the Let's Talk Race series where we've approached almost 3,000 people have participated in our Let's Talk Race dialogue, where we give people opportunities to have candid conversations about things like systemic racism and individual acts of racism, which we know are sadly too many of those still happening as well. But we know in our library system and in our community that it's systemic racism, sometimes unacknowledged or unknown, that continues to create a divide for the life outcomes of our citizens here in Columbia and beyond. And so there are 2 beliefs that I have that are foundational for me as a human and as a citizen and as a leader. And I'm going to share these with you as I introduce you and our moderator, Professor Donaldson. The first belief that I have that is foundational is a few months back, we hosted Dr. Ibram X. Kendi at our library, in much the same way we're hosting you tonight. And he said these words. He said, there is no such thing as a race neutral policy. There is no such thing as a race neutral policy. And I have internalized those words. And to me, that means that every decision we make as leaders, elected officials, governments, municipalities, has an impact. It either creates a barrier or an opportunity for us to close the racial equity gap. Every single decision. And if you believe this statement, the responsibilities are tremendous as leaders, but also as citizens to hold us accountable. So when you have a book like The Color of Law, it clearly and with wonderful insight and research explains the devastating impacts of government created and sanctioned policies that were designed to segregate our neighborhoods. So tonight we get to hear from Richard Rothstein, whose book has informed and inspired all of our discussions in this series. Richard Rothstein is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and of the Haas Institute of the University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. The book expands upon and provides a national perspective on his recent work that has documented the history of state-sponsored residential segregation, as documented in another of his works entitled The Making of Ferguson. He is the author of Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right in Class and Schools, Using Social, Economic, and Educational Reform to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap. He's also the author of other books, including The Way We Were, Myths and Realities of America's Student Achievement. Mr. Rothstein, thank you for being with us tonight. The second belief that I have I've come to see as foundational in this work that we're all trying to push forward in dismantling systemic racism is that we have to really understand the history of our neighborhoods. We have to examine the roles of the organizations, the businesses, the leaders, and the people that shape that history. And we could not have picked a better moderator for this important discussion this evening than Dr. Bobby Donaldson. Dr. Bobby Donaldson serves as Professor of History and the Director of Center for Civil Rights History and Research at the University of South Carolina. He serves as the lead scholar and director for the Columbia SC63, a documentary project that examines the struggle for civil rights and social justice in Columbia and around the state of South Carolina. Over the past 2 decades, he has worked with colleagues, students, and Columbia residents to document the history of communities such as Ward 1, Wheeler Hill, Arsenal Hill, and Booker Washington Heights, historic African-American neighborhoods here that were adversely impacted by redlining and urban renewal campaigns. During the course of Dr. Donaldson's academic career, he served as Benjamin E. Mays Andrews Mellon Fellow and a member of the Board of Trustees of Wesleyan University, as an editorial assistant for the Martin Luther King Jr. Papers Project at Emory and Stanford Universities, and as a Thurgood Marshall Dissertation Fellow and visiting assistant professor at Dartmouth College, and as a fellow of the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and American Research at Harvard University. He's received many awards, including the Distinguished Michael J. Mungo Undergraduate Teaching Award, the John N. Gardner Inspirational Faculty Award, the Martin Luther King Jr. Social Justice Award, and in 2017, he was awarded the Stephen Morrison Visionary Award by the One Columbia for Arts and History organization. Bobby, we are so thrilled that you're moderating this evening. For our guest, a couple of notes. Please note that tonight's discussion is made possible thanks to funding from Dominion Energy Charitable Foundation and the SC Humanities. We're recording tonight's discussion. It will be available on the library's YouTube channel. And lastly, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat below and we will get to as many questions as possible at the end of our discussion. Dr. Donaldson and Mr. Rothstein, Bobby and Richard, take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Melanie. I'm honored to be here this evening, and Richard, welcome back to Columbia. Tonight is an ongoing series sponsored by the Center for Civil Rights History and Research, the Columbia SC63 Project, Richland Libraries, Historic Columbia, and the City of Columbia. And we're indebted to Mayor Benjamin and Councilwoman Devine for the inspiration for this endeavor. And I'm very honored tonight to be in conversation with Richard Rothstein. Over the past several months, we have talked about this book, about its history and its implications for Columbia. And periodically, people will ask me, well, what does the author think about this? What does the author think about that? And tonight I am relieved that I don't have to speak for the author. The author is with us tonight, and Richard, we're delighted that you're here tonight. This book is 342 pages. It has clearly struck a nerve among so many around this nation. And I want to begin by speaking to you about the origins of the book. It has been described as powerful, provocative, and disturbing. Around 2007, when you began this endeavor, you thought it might have a passing notice among the public. And now you realize it's far greater than probably you anticipated those years ago. So for our listening audience, would you explain the origins of this project, this book, and what is within it? What is it within your findings that is so disturbing to readers?
Sure, Professor Donaldson, Bobby. I spent much of my time before I started working on this book over 10 years ago, really, as an education policy writer. I knew nothing about housing. I was the education columnist at the New York Times. I was writing about education policy for the Economic Policy Institute that Melanie Huggins mentioned a few minutes ago. And I came to understand that the biggest problem facing American education today was the difference in average achievement between Black and white students, what we call the achievement gap. And we were following a policy in the 1990s and 2000s, which I thought made no sense whatsoever. And so I was writing column after column about it. The policy was that we had an achievement gap between Black and white students. And the reason we had it was that teachers just didn't try very hard to teach Black children. They had low expectations. And if only we could raise teacher expectations, the achievement gap would disappear. I know it sounds ludicrous, but this was widely agreed across the political spectrum. We enacted a law in 2001 based on this belief called the No Child Left Behind law. And that law prescribed annual testing of children in math and reading with the idea that if teachers could be held accountable for their children's test scores, the achievement gap would disappear. They would just try harder. As I say, I thought it was a ludicrous theory. It, of course, didn't work. It's now, 20 years later, and the achievement gap is as big as it was in 2001. Of course, some teachers have low expectations, but that's not the major reason for the achievement gap. The reason we have an achievement gap is because so many Black children in urban neighborhoods come to school with social and economic challenges that make it difficult for schools to succeed. And I remember writing one column about asthma, for example. As you may know, low-income children in urban neighborhoods in this country, African-American neighborhoods in particular, have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. It's an amazing difference. And they have asthma at such a high rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more dirt in the environment, more dilapidated buildings. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't have asthma to be up at night wheezing and then come to school drowsy the next day. So you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect. Same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure. But one has a higher rate of asthma, that's going to have slightly lower achievement. Not by a big amount, but then you begin to think of all of the social and economic disadvantages that African-American children come to school with, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning that has an impact on IQ, or homelessness or economic insecurity. And you've pretty much explained the achievement gap. And it's true that some teachers have low expectations, but this is the reason. And then I realized that, well, it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity, but what happens if you have a school where every child has one or more of these conditions? How can you ever expect such a school to achieve at the same level as a school where children come well rested, in good health, well nourished, in secure homes? Obviously, you can't have that expectation no matter how many laws you pass. And then I realized that when you concentrate children in schools like this, we call them segregated schools, and schools today are more segregated in this country than they ever have been in the last 45 years. But these schools exist as concentrated areas of disadvantage because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to conclude that neighborhood segregation was a public education problem. And the more I began to look into it, I stopped writing about education and began to study more and more about housing policy. And now, of course, I'm not writing about education at all, but just about the history of how we came to be such a segregated society.
Well, I want to move into an excerpt from your preface. You write the following: today's residential segregation around the country is not the unintended consequence of individual choices and of otherwise well-meaning law or regulation, but of unhidden public policy that explicitly segregated every community in the United States. The policy was so systematic and forceful that its effects endured to the present time. So could you explain how housing segregation has contributed to where we are now in terms of the inequalities in our nation?
Well, I'll try to do it in less than 200 pages. Um, the theme of the book, as you know, is that we have a national myth, a rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for not taking residential segregation as a serious problem. And the myth, the rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that um, while forms of segregation that we challenged in the 20th century, like restaurants or buses or public accommodations, that was all done by government. Residential segregation, as you say, was simply the result of private choices, people wanting to live with each other of the same race, maybe the bigotry of homeowners or landlords who wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans, or maybe it's the result of private businesses like banks and realtors who discriminated. And since none of these were done by government, it's not a civil rights violation. And if it's not a civil rights violation, the Supreme Court has said government is powerless to do anything about it. The name we give to this is, we say we have de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact, not in law. And what I show in this book is that, of course, there was private bigotry. There still is. But the reason we have segregation in every metropolitan area of this country is because of racially explicit federal, state, and local policies that were designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. And if you're asking how this affects the inequality we have today, I'll give you this example, and I'll try to make it brief. In the post-World War II period, the federal government embarked on a program to suburbanize the entire white population into single-family homes in all white suburbs. Prior to that time, the only people who were living in suburbs were affluent people. White, middle-class, working-class families, as well as blacks, were living in urban areas simply because we were primarily a manufacturing economy at that time. And factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. So workers, both black and white, were living in broadly the same neighborhoods, integrated in many cases, much more integrated, even in South Carolina than they are today. And the federal government decided to move all the whites out of there and to move them into single family homes in the suburbs. You're familiar with these suburbs. They exist everywhere in every metropolitan area of the country, and yours as well as mine and everywhere else. Perhaps the most famous one is outside New York City. Perhaps you've heard of it, Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. Well, where was William Levitt going to get the money to buy the land and build 17,000 homes that he didn't yet have any buyers for? No bank would be crazy enough to lend him that money. As I said, we were in a suburban country at that time. They thought it was a crazy idea. The only way that Levitt could get the money to build this project, and this is true of every developer, every suburb in the country today that was created in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and through the 1960s as we suburbanized. The only way they could get the money to build these projects was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, seeking a federal bank guarantee for their developments. And in order to get that bank guarantee from the federal government, they had to commit to the FHA and the VA that they would never sell a home to an African American. The FHA and VA even required developers like William Levitt and all of the others like him to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And if you or any of your colleagues in Columbia live in a home that was created in the mid-20th century, it's likely if you look in your deed, you'll see you're living in a place that's for Caucasians only. This was federal policy. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was written out in a federal policy manual called the Underwriting Manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to consider applications of builders for federal bank guarantees. The manual said you could not give a federal bank guarantee to a developer who was going to build a project that was not segregated. You couldn't even give a bank guarantee to a developer who was going to build an all-white project that was going to be near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. There's no basis in historical fact to it whatsoever. Now, I can answer directly your question about how this impacts today. Those homes, those suburban homes that were created by the federal government in every metropolitan area were inexpensive at the time. In about 1950, they sold for $8,000 or $9,000. In today's money, that's about $100,000 a piece. Any working class family, any returning war veteran, black or white, can afford a home for $100,000 with a long-term amortized mortgage. In fact, if they were veterans, no down payment was required. Many whites and African Americans at the time were living in public housing. It was not a program only for African Americans, as it became. And the white families could leave public housing and pay less in their monthly housing costs for these $100,000 homes than they were paying for rent in public housing. Well, those homes no longer sell for $100,000 today. I don't know what they sell for in Colombia, but I don't think you can buy one for $100,000, can you? I doubt it. What, $300,000, $400,000 perhaps for these suburban homes? The white families who were subsidized by the federal government to move to these suburbs gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the equity appreciation of their homes, the difference between $100,000 and current market value. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to finance medical emergencies, maybe temporary unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by federal policy from participating in this wealth generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, family incomes, they're about 60% of white incomes. There's still a big disparity there. There's a whole story to be told about that. I won't go into that now. But you'd think if there was a 60% ratio of Black family incomes to white family incomes, that you'd have a similar 60% ratio for wealth as well. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, although African American families have incomes that on average are 60% of white family incomes, African American wealth is only 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. And I emphasize that it's unconstitutional because it was a civil rights violation. And we have an obligation as American citizens, all of us, to remedy violations of the Constitution when we see them. So by failing to recognize this history, we excuse ourselves from the obligation to remedy it. Now that wealth gap, that enormous wealth gap, determines much of the inequality that we have today, even though the policies are no longer being enforced. We're no longer saying to African Americans, you can't move to these suburbs, but the suburbs are no longer affordable to working middle-class families of either race if they don't have down payments, at the very least, to access them. That wealth gap reinforces the segregation that we know. I mentioned earlier that it's responsible in large part for the achievement gap in schools. It's responsible for health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have, on average, shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease because they live in more polluted, more dangerous neighborhoods. It's responsible for mass incarceration of young African American men. I'm not suggesting that the police would never abuse young African American men if it weren't for segregation, but it becomes much more intense and likely because of segregation when we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods where they have no access to good jobs or the transportation to get to them, or schools that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of their students. It's inevitable that the police are going to engage in confrontations with those young men. They're going to assume the stance of an occupying force, much as police forces did in colonial countries in the 20th century, in India, the Congo, when they had to keep local populations under control. And let me conclude with this, if I may, Bobby. The wealth gap that we created with this one policy, and there's so many other policies, explicit, racially explicit policies that the federal government, state and local governments followed to ensure segregation. I described many of the others in The Color of Law, but this wealth gap also is responsible in large part for the very, very frightening political polarization that we have in this country today, which largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. President Biden talked about national unity the other day. How can we ever develop a common national identity if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to understand each other's life experiences? How can we develop a common national identity under those circumstances? So that's the ongoing consequence of this unconstitutional policy that the federal government followed in the mid-20th century, a policy that we have forgotten. It was well known at the time. This was never hidden. It was all there out in the open in the 1950s and 1960s, up until the early 1970s. And since then, we've forgotten about it. And because we've forgotten about it, we feel no obligation to remedy it.
So you argue in Color of Law that the only way to have a national identity is by developing some sort of consensus on the history of this nation, and particularly the history of racial inequity. And one of the great contributions of the book is not only do you look closely at federal policies and federal laws, you look at the lived and real experiences of African Americans who've been adversely impacted by these policies. You mentioned Levittown, and you mentioned in the book, there's a story about a gentleman who helped to build Levittown, an African American trucker. And you look that his family roots are in South Carolina.
That's right.
In a small community called Hamburg, about an hour from Columbia. And part of what you argue is that there has been a failure of scholars and historians to tell the history of the origins of racial segregation. And part of what you've done in this book is to outline how that evolved. So for readers who've not had a chance to read the book, what are the sources and what are the documents that you've examined that tell this untold or hidden history of segregation?
Yes, I'm going to take exception to one thing you said, and that is that scholars and historians haven't researched this. I'm not a historian. I'm not a professional historian. I'm a journalist. The thing I'm proudest about is that in the 4 years that the book has been out, roughly, no professional historian has challenged a single fact that I've described. It's incontrovertible, but I didn't have to dig this up on my own. There are many scholarly books about it. It's never been written for a popular audience before. You're a historian. I'm sure you read Massey and Denton's book, American Apartheid. You've read Kenneth Jackson's book, Crabgrass Frontier. All of this has been well documented by scholars. What has been missing is a popularization of it so ordinary citizens, and they're the people who need to know it, so that ordinary citizens can learn this history, because this myth of de facto segregation has paralyzed ordinary citizens from being able to understand their obligation to redress it. We need a new civil rights movement in this country that's going to be as aggressive as the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s to make it as uncomfortable to maintain racial segregation of neighborhoods as the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s made it uncomfortable to maintain segregation of buses or water fountains or lunch counters and so on. So that's what's needed. If I can make a quick pitch, I'm working with a group of national civil rights leaders and fair housing advocates to create something we call a new movement to redress racial segregation. We actually have a group of people in Greenville who are interested in becoming one of the first chapters of this new movement. We're going to launch it as soon as social distancing permits the organization of local committees. And when we do launch it, if any of the listeners on this webinar are interested in receiving the announcement of the launch, I can make it available to you, Bobby, or to Melanie. And if you have a list of people who attended this webinar, you can send out the link so that they can receive it.
Okay. Well, I have no doubt that you'll have some people who are very eager to join that conversation. As I indicated, this book has provoked a lot of discussions and questions in the city of Columbia and around the nation. And so I want to now turn to Tamara King, who is the Director of Community Engagement for Richland Library, to provide some questions from our listening audience. So Tamara?
Thank you so much, Dr. Donaldson and Richard, since you want us to call you Richard. Thank you so much for such a thought-provoking conversation and a great history lesson of where we are today. We've had quite a few questions, and I definitely want to dig into them. First question, I think this is a question that we're all kind of wondering. We have someone on the line who asked a question about what is the benefit from the government? What would the federal government benefit see in keeping people segregated?
No, the federal government didn't benefit. In fact, the federal government has been greatly harmed by, we have many serious social problems, as I indicated before, because of this segregation. This country has never dealt with the legacies of slavery and of Jim Crow, never confronted it. We never had what in South Africa they call truth and reconciliation in order to understand what the consequences of those policies are and how they affect us today. And that's the reason that the government did it. Ever since the end of Reconstruction in 1877, there was a gradual growth of Jim Crow, of segregation in all areas of American life. African Americans came to be considered as a result of the reinstitution of a near slave system, not slavery formally, but throughout the South, as you know better than I do, of a near slave system that created an image, on the part of white Americans that African Americans were less than human. And that's a legacy that has to be confronted. You know, we all think of the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, the New Deal, as being a progressive movement. And it was. It provided economic benefits for the first time, both to African Americans and whites. But it was always on a segregated basis. The Democratic Party, North and South, I don't fault the South alone for this. The Democratic Party, North and South, was a policy of segregation. And when it implemented housing policies for the first time in American history, there was never any money, federal money, put into housing before the New Deal, before the Roosevelt administration. It put it in on a segregated basis, creating and reinforcing the residential segregation that we have today. You're muted, I think.
I see. I'm trying to give you your floor. What specific policies, we had another question about what specific policy proposals would you recommend for the federal, state, and local officials to enact to address the wealth gap and education inequity between Black and white communities?
Well, let me say, Tamara, that the policies to redress segregation are well known. There's no mystery about them. Policy experts, think tanks, journalists like me throw them out all the time. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to make it uncomfortable not to implement those policies. So I can describe some policies to you. For example, I mentioned before the way in which these all-white suburbs were created, and then they grew in value to the point where African Americans can no longer live in them, move into them. You know, in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act. It said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you can now move into Levittown, for example. But of course, Levittown is now unaffordable to working class families of either race. Well, how would we redress that? I think it's obvious. Levittown, as a result of the Fair Housing Act, now has an African American population of about 1 to 2%. As Bobby mentioned, there were many African Americans who could have bought into Levittown when it was available. He mentioned a trucking company that was owned and operated by the family of a South Carolina family that moved north. This trucking company delivered sheetrock to Levittown when it was being built for the walls, had a contract with Levitt, but the owners and the family members of this trucking company weren't permitted to live there. Well, what the federal government should be doing, they say it's now 1 to 2% African Americans as a result of the Fair Housing Act. Levittown's in a neighborhood, a broader neighborhood that's about 15% African American. Federal government should be buying up homes in Levittown for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, whatever the market rate requires, and reselling them to qualified African Americans for something closer to $100,000 that their families would have paid had they been permitted to purchase them when white families were purchasing them. Now, that's a federal policy. At the state and local level, many things that we can do. For example, we have programs of the federal government now and local governments that reinforce segregation. As you quoted Ibram Kendi before from saying these are race-neutral programs, but there's no such thing as race-neutral programs when you have an existing inequality that they build upon. So the biggest program for low-income families who are disproportionately African American in places like Columbia and elsewhere is something called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's a program administered by the Treasury Department that gives tax credits to developers through states to build low-income housing. Most low-income housing today with this federal tax credit, it's a race-neutral program, but somehow it reinforces segregation because most low-income housing tax credit developments are placed in existing low-income neighborhoods because it's easier to do it that way once you have this kind of inequality. Developers would rather build projects, build housing for low-income families in neighborhoods where they don't have to have a lot of community meetings to explain why you're bringing Black and brown people into their neighborhood. Developers would rather build low-income housing in places where the land is cheaper. They'd rather build it where it's easy to rent vacancies because you can put a sign in the window and lots of low-income people walk by. Well, we should have local policies, state policies as well as local policies that distribute those low-income units throughout the metropolitan area so that they're not only placed in existing low-income neighborhoods that reinforce segregation. Another program that we have for low-income families who are disproportionately African American is, and I'm sure you've all heard of this, the Section 8 voucher program. It's a subsidy that's given to families to enable them to rent and sometimes even buy homes at the market values when their incomes aren't big enough to support that. Well, the Section 8 voucher program also today reinforces segregation because most Section 8 vouchers are only usable in low-income segregated neighborhoods. Landlords are permitted in most places to use the fact that someone has a voucher as an excuse for not renting to them. If you have a voucher, a landlord can say, we're not going to rent to you because you have a voucher. It's that explicit. We should prohibit that kind of discrimination, and localities can do that. Many localities, well, not many, some localities have, most have not, but that's an easy reform that can immediately be implemented. Let me make one other suggestion about a local policy. In the course of writing The Color of Law, and I write about this in the book, I examined the history textbooks that are used in American history courses in high schools all over the country. Everyone lies about the history that I described to you. They promote the myth of de facto segregation. They talk about the great work that the federal government built in creating suburbs without ever mentioning that they were for whites only. They talk about how the New Deal created housing for people who were homeless, never mentioning that it was created on a segregated basis, segregating neighborhoods that had previously been integrated with separate projects for whites and African Americans. Well, if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than we've learned it, they're going to be as poor a position to remedy it as we have. So one of the things that a local civil rights group can do is conduct a campaign to get its local school district to teach the history of race more accurately. So that, and that's an easy thing to do, relatively, nothing's easy in this field, but it's a lot easier than changing housing policy, but it's a step on the way to changing housing policy, because I guarantee you, if you start a discussion in Columbia or any of Columbia's suburbs about how a school is teaching its history, that conversation will leak out into the adult community as well and raise awareness there also. We actually, I mentioned before, the new movement to redress racial segregation have some curricular materials that are free, that can be used by high school teachers. Again, if you have a follow-up email to your attendees, I can give you links to those. They're free. So this is another thing that can be done at a local level to redress racial segregation, or at least start the process of having the community conversation that will lead to redressing segregation.
This is a really interesting question too, from one of our participants tonight. There's a growth of Hispanic population in our country as well. How are the challenges of this population similar and dissimilar to those of African Americans? And are we repeating a history of racism with a new population in current day?
Well, they're similar and different. They're similar in this sense. If we implemented remedies for the unconstitutional racial segregation that we created, Hispanic families would benefit from those as well. For example, if we reformed the Section 8 voucher program, or reformed the low-income housing tax credit program, so that it enabled families in those programs to live in higher opportunity communities where there was clean air and fresh food available and access to good jobs and transportation. Latino families as well as African-American families would benefit from them. But recent immigrants are not segregated because of the kind of unconstitutional policy that African-Americans were segregated for. It's always been the case that new immigrants to the country, low-wage immigrants, live in areas of homogenous areas where their language is spoken, where they have access to job networks. That's normal, that's natural. And eventually, as has been happening, this was the case of Jews, it was the case of the Irish, it was the case of the Italians. And eventually, over the next few generations, they were able to move out. African Americans have not been permitted to move out of segregated neighborhoods. So the history is very different, but some of the remedies that we need to implement to redress the history of unconstitutional segregation would benefit other groups in addition to African Americans.
I have two questions. I'm going to try to see if we can get through them, but I think they're both really good questions. One of the questions you just kind of talked about, changing the Section 8 voucher program. Someone wants to know, are you in favor of school vouchers to allow parents to use these vouchers to attend the school of their choice for their children?
No, I'm not. What we need to do is to desegregate schools so that all schools are good schools. We need to desegregate neighborhoods so that all children attend schools where there's not a high concentration of disadvantaged children whose social and economic problems overwhelm the ability of schools to address them. Vouchers don't solve that problem. What they do is they enable the most motivated parents, the most highly educated parents typically, to remove their children from schools in their neighborhoods and perhaps attend others, although Columbia, I know, is a relatively small city, so this may not apply, but most cities of this country, African-American children live so far distant from middle-class white communities that it does no good to give them a voucher. They have no way of getting to those schools. So I think it's an invasion of our responsibility to confront the segregation of schools. And what we need to do is desegregate neighborhoods so that all neighborhood schools are good schools.
And another question, given that housing ownership has been a way of growing wealth, what are your thoughts on reparations to provide a basis for African Americans to get into home ownership?
Well, I don't use the term reparations. I think it's too narrow. If we ever had reparations in this country, and there's no political support for them now, and there won't be until there's a much, much broader civil rights movement than I've even been anticipating. But if it was, it would be too token an amount to make up for the enormous wealth gap that we have in this country. We're not about to give $100,000 to every African American who's a descendant of American slaves. So I don't think it's practical, but we can implement policies that get African Americans into home ownership from which they were excluded as a result of these policies of segregation. I mentioned one before. The federal government should be subsidizing African Americans to move to communities from which they were excluded when they were affordable. There are many communities, you asked before about local things that communities can do. There are communities in this country that have their own down payment assistance programs for what they call first-time home buyers. Of course, they think they're not permitted to use the term race, Black or African American, but everybody knows who they're talking about when they implement these programs. This is creating a down payment assistance program for African Americans or first-time home buyers, if you want to call them that, is a good way to approach that. That's the way to get families into home ownership. Waiting for reparations won't get very many families into it.
And I'm going to put two questions together because they both kind of are very similar. One, do you believe gerrymandering has affected segregation and racial and residential segregation as you talk about it? And also, what your book talks clearly about politics and how they've ostracized Black communities. And you mentioned earlier about what politics have done, pitting neighborhoods against neighborhoods and people against people. What do you think about gerrymandering and its effect on segregation? And can you just talk a little bit more about how politics have caused that ostracized Black communities?
Well, gerrymandering is a complicated issue, but what typically happens is that conservative legislators try to pack African Americans into single districts so that single legislative districts, so that it removes them from other legislative districts and they have no influence. So they're able to elect African American representatives in these concentrated districts, but then have no influence elsewhere. There have been, it's controversial because some African American leaders like that. It makes it easier for them to run for office. But overall, it diminishes African American power because it means that legislators in all white districts no longer have to pay attention to African American interests. That having been said, yes, I think gerrymandering makes it more difficult to redress segregation. It makes it more difficult to enact policies of all kinds that benefit working and middle-class families. So it is a very harmful practice in my view.
I think too, this is a good question. Probably one of the last. One person wants to know what their neighborhood can do to further the discussion with our state legislature about how South Carolina residents can create more equitable spaces in our community. So to speak, this question is an action item for everyone on the call. What can neighborhoods do to confront this issue and talk to their state legislature about how to make more equitable spaces in our community?
Well, as you can tell from what I've said earlier, my focus is not on talking to the state legislature because there's not enough political support at this point for the policies we need to enact. I think what neighbors should be doing is talking to each other, talking to their neighbors, making an awareness of our obligation as American citizens to do something about this problem widespread and public. Neighbors should be writing letters to newspapers, volunteering to write op-eds, using social media to talk about how their communities came to be segregated and educating families. This is something that both Blacks and whites have to learn. African Americans have as much of a mythology about de facto segregation as whites do. They know more about the fact that they're segregated. They don't know how it became that way. And so everybody needs to have a much broader community education program, say starting with the schools perhaps, to build a base of support so we can talk to legislators. Right now it's premature. We're not going to get anywhere because there's no state that I know of where there's enough political support to enact the policies that we need to enact to redress racial segregation. That's why a new movement to redress racial segregation is necessary.
Is that an opportunity for the current administration? Do you know of any Congress people or any movements that are happening about these policies that have crippled the communities?
Look, this is not a political talk, and I'm not going to talk politically, but I don't think it's any mystery uh, uh, that you probably imagine that I am very relieved that we have President Biden and Vice President Harris now in office. Having said that, I don't expect them to do much in this area, again, because there's no political support. The Biden-Harris ticket was elected with two major constituencies. One was African Americans. In fact, Joe Biden would not be our president today if African Americans in South Carolina hadn't turned out in enormous numbers in the Democratic primary in South Carolina to choose him. So that's one constituency, but the other constituency that was essential to the Biden-Harris victory was white suburbanites who were offended by the authoritarian actions and the clownish behavior of the former president. Those white suburbanites are people we call NIMBYs, not in my backyard. And they support progressive policies of the Biden-Harris administration so long as it doesn't affect their own neighborhoods. And so that's something that needs to be changed before the Biden administration is going to be in a position to enact meaningful reform to redress segregation of housing. The other thing I'd say is that we have such a terrible crisis now as a result of the pandemic, as a result of evictions, as a result of homelessness, as a result of demands that people make up rent that they have not paid when the pandemic ends. And that's a crisis that requires immediate attention. And in the area of housing, that's going to take the Biden administration's attention, as it should. It's an immediate crisis. But to use a cliche, we can chew gum and cross the street at the same time. And while we're addressing this immediate crisis, we ought to be thinking also about the long-term devastation to this country that residential segregation has created and continues to create, because we've got to deal with it in the medium term, if not immediately, as we're addressing the crisis of homelessness and evictions that we will inevitably have to confront at the end of this pandemic.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Dr. Donaldson. Thank you, Councilwoman Devine and Mayor Benjamin, as well as our Executive Director, Melanie Huggins. All of you were inspired by this book, and tonight's talk is a fruition of your hard work. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Mr. Rothstein, for being here. We truly appreciate it. And if you are a novice, if you're someone who just are coming to this conversation and this is the first time you're hearing about the color of law, is there any other books or resources or material you think that if I had to read one thing that's going to really help kind of move you along on your path to finding out more information, what would that be?
Well, as I said, there are very few books for a popular general audience on this topic. But for those who really want to get into it, the two books I mentioned earlier, American Apartheid by Massey and Denton, Douglas Massey, and Nancy Denton, Massey, is one that I'd recommend. Crabgrass Frontier by Kenneth Jackson is another that I would recommend. There are many local histories. There's a book by Tom Segrew about how Detroit came to be segregated. There's a book by, what's his name? I'm sorry, it's about Chicago. It's called The Making of the Second Ghetto. Bobby, can you provide the who's the author of that?
Can't call a name now.
Okay, he passed away about 2 years ago, but it's an excellent book and worth reading. Those are the ones I would recommend for starters.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for this conversation again. And we want to thank each of our audience and every member that's been here today. We appreciate you being on, and hopefully you found this conversation as interesting, as intriguing, and a little disturbing even tonight's conversation. Thank you so much for that. We also want to thank the Dominion Energy Charitable Foundation and SE Humanities for helping to sponsor this talk. And I will now introduce Randy Heath. He is our Let's Talk Race chair, as well as the director of our Edgewood location. And he will have some upcoming events and talk a little bit more about the fourth part of the Color of Law series. Randy?
Thank you, Tamara. Wow, Mr. Rothstein and Dr. Donaldson, thank you so much. What a fantastic discussion. What a pleasure to just learn from you both. And so we got a lot of things going on. And so, as Tamara mentioned, the Color of Law session 4, where do we go from here? Innovative solutions from today's mayors will be held on Thursday, February 4th, from 6 to 8 p.m. You can register for the event by going to historiccolumbia.org. Again, you can go to historiccolumbia.org to register. Also, we have some upcoming events at Richland Library. We have our Let's Talk Race Watch and Listen group on Tuesday, February the 2nd from 7 to 8 p.m., where we will be discussing the New York Times audio series 1619. We also have our Let's Talk Race community conversation, where it's an opportunity for just us as a community to talk together about racial issues. And that's going to be on Thursday, February the 11th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. We do that at least once a month. We also have our Let's Talk Race Teen Book Club. The next one will be on Saturday, March the 6th. We will be reading Dr. Ibram S. Kendi's book, along with Jason Reynolds, Stamped: Racism, Anti-Racism, and You. Please register your teens and check out the book by visiting us online. We also have an event coming up on Sunday, February the 21st from 6:30 to 8, a candid conversation with Jane Elliott. So we have a lot of things going on. You can register for all of these events by visiting richlandlibrary.com. For more resources about understanding race, equity, and inclusion, please visit the Richland Library's website at richlandlibrary.com/race. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight for a fantastic discussion. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here.